November 2025, and ladies and gentlemen, it just happened. The moment every economist swore could never happen again. The moment the media said was a conspiracy theory. The moment the Federal Reserve has been praying you wouldn't notice just hit the U.S. financial system like a freight train. Because tonight, I'm going to show you the exact data, the exact charts, and the exact $6 trillion mistake that the Federal Reserve made. The mistake that has now triggered the next liquidity meltdown. And listen, this isn't doom and gloom. This isn't speculation. And this has nothing to do with politics. In fact, Joe Biden isn't in office anymore. Donald J. Trump is the president of the United States right now, and even he cannot stop what the Fed already set into motion. The truth is simple. The Fed lost control. They know it. The banks know it. The markets know it. And by the time we're done here, you're going to know it too, because what I'm about to walk you through explains why SOFR, the key funding rate in America, just broke above the Fed's own benchmark, why banks secretly borrowed billions from the Fed's emergency window, why reserves collapsed to the lowest level in years, and why the Federal Reserve is now trapped in a no-win scenario that will cause either a 2008-style collapse or inflation so big it makes 2022 look like a gentle breeze. And the crazy part, they can't hide it anymore. In fact, the charts are public, the numbers are public, the timeline is public, everything is out in the open, but the media won't cover a single second of it. Wall Street won't touch it. And the Federal Reserve, well, they're just hoping you stay distracted by anything but this. Because what happens next affects every dollar you have, your savings, your mortgage, your retirement, your grocery bill, your rent, your investments, and the financial stability of the entire country. So buckle up, folks, because tonight I'm going to show you why the Fed's $6 trillion blunder, the one that they created, the one they denied, the one they hoped would quietly unwind, has now detonated under the U.S. financial system, and why the next crisis isn't coming. Unfortunately, it's already here. Hit the like button and subscribe. All right, let's start with what I meant by the Fed's $6 trillion mistake, because this is the foundation of everything that follows, okay? Pay attention, grab a piece of paper, a pen if you need to take notes. For more than a decade, the Fed printed trillions of dollars through quantitative easing and then tried to quarantine that liquidity inside the banking system. Then, during 2020 through 2022, they slammed the gas pedal to the floor and they blew the balance sheet out toward $9 trillion. That river of money inflated stocks, real estate, and debt levels everywhere. But here's the fatal error. They never built a real exit plan. So once the pile got big enough, shrinking it without breaking funding markets became mathematically impossible. That's when the meltdown wave quietly began unfolding underneath everything. Now, let's talk about the first visible crack in the dam, the secured overnight financing rate, or the SOFR. Now, this is the average interest rate that big institutions pay to borrow cash overnight using treasuries as collateral. Now, normally the SOF trades a little bit below what the Fed itself pays banks on reserves. And that makes sense. Why lend to someone else for less than you can earn risk-free at the Fed, right? But in the last stretch, SOFR has repeatedly jumped above the Fed's rate. That flip is everything. It means cash in the safest market on earth is suddenly scarce. Now, we already saw similar stress in 2008 and in March 2020, right before things broke wide open. Again, violently fast, reckless, and system-wide. So now here's where the warning lights stop blinking and start blaring. Banks have been tapping the Fed's standing repo facility like their lives depend on it. In fact, this window is supposed to be a last resort emergency line. This is something that the banks avoid because it signals weakness, yet in late October, borrowing suddenly spiked to $50 billion in a single day. This is the highest usage since the facility was created. And since September, banks have kept returning to it again and again and again. Now, this is not normal, guys. That's banks saying, we can't get the cash that we need from the market. It's the financial version of breaking glass and pulling the alarm handle. It tells us stress is no longer theoretical. It's already spreading beneath the surface. You know that deep breath that you take after solving a problem that you've been avoiding? That's the sound people make after fixing their Medicare plan with Chapter. That's why I partner with Chapter. They simplify your Medicare coverage until you can finally exhale again. Now, one viewer said, I didn't realize how much stress my plan was causing me until Chapter fixed it. So let me ask, when was the last time you felt that kind of relief? Now, most people are already feeling it after calling 909-563-8279 or visiting askchapter.org/Ron. So let me ask, Do you want your retirement drained, or are you going to do what most people already are and protecting it? Oh, and don't take my word for it. Listen to what Vicky had to say. She said, talk to Chapter. They were a big help. I saved a lot. Thank you for sharing and helping us all. God bless. Tina also said, I got help from Chapter. Thank you. It was so great. But look, the real danger comes when you look at the bank reserves. This is the cash that banks actually hold at the Fed. Now, those reserves have fallen to about $2.8 trillion. Only a hair above the minimum level needed to keep funding markets stable. Quantitative tightening from 2022 to 2024 drained so much cash from the system that banks no longer have the cushion that they once relied on. And so even though the Fed is halting QT in December 1st, that only freezes reserves. It doesn't build them. It doesn't rebuild them. And so we're sitting at a very critically low level with no buffer. And so when you combine that with tight reserves, with rising funding demand, you get an environment where one shock can cascade into a full-blown liquidity freeze. The system is literally running on fumes. Now, here's where the math becomes impossible to ignore. Daily repo market volume, already enormous, it has exploded from roughly $1.5 trillion to more than $3 trillion per day. Now, that is a doubling in the amount of overnight funding that the system needs just to function. Why? Because the government is issuing an avalanche of new treasury debt. And the big players, the banks, money market funds, primary dealers, they fund those purchases in the repo market. That's right, guys, the repo market. But with reserves falling at the same time, demand is shooting upward while supply is shrinking. That is the exact formula that pushes funding rates higher, squeezes institutions, and it forces them into emergency borrowing. It's not a temporary mismatch. It is a mathematical disaster in slow motion. And the reason that the repo demand keeps rising is simple. The government's $2 trillion annual deficit. Even under President Trump in 2025, spending remained stuck at roughly 23% of GDP, far above historical norms for peacetime. Now, this isn't about one administration or the other. Both parties agreed on spending. They only disagreed on the categories. And so this means that the Treasury keeps issuing more debt than the market can comfortably absorb. And so when issuance breaks past global demand limits, repo markets get overloaded. Tight liquidity and massive deficits can't coexist without triggering stress. This isn't cyclical. This is structural. And it guarantees that funding strain will keep intensifying as long as deficits remain in the trillions. And so this is where everything locks into place and why the Fed's situation is now irreversible. So when government spending remains high and bank reserves remain low, you create what economists call a liquidity trap, but not the academic kind. This is the real world version. The borrowing requirement of the government becomes larger than the available liquidity in the system. And so this means every dollar of Treasury issuance competes with shrinking bank cash, rising repo demand, and stressed collateral markets. Even halting QT doesn't solve it because the reserves stay frozen at critically low levels. The trap is already sprung. There's no path for the Fed to shrink its balance sheet again without blowing out the funding markets. This isn't a future risk. This is the present reality. And the newest data confirms it. In fact, the Fed's entire plan from 2022 to 2025 has collapsed under its own weight. The goal was to slowly unwind the pandemic era balance sheet and return to something resembling pre-2020 levels. But the markets began breaking long before that. Funding rates rose, emergency borrowing surged, liquidity stress indicators like SOFR spreads and collateral shortages started flashing red. In other words, the data proves the system can't handle QT. Even with Trump in the White House and financial markets relatively stable on the surface, the Fed aimed for a controlled landing. That's right, the Fed aimed for a controlled landing. Instead, it discovered the runway was gone. And this failure is what forces QE to return, whether they admit it or not. And so here's where the mask comes off. Lori Logan, president of the Dallas Fed and one of the most influential voices inside the Federal Reserve System, openly admitted in late 2025 that if repo rates remain elevated, the Fed will need to buy assets. There's no ambiguity in that statement. Buying assets is quantitative easing, or QE. She's not theorizing. She's not speculating. She's not speaking academically. She's just telling you exactly what the Fed is preparing to do. The stunning part is that she said it publicly. Now, this means the internal projections are worse than they're letting on. In fact, QE is not coming because they want to stimulate the economy. It's coming because the funding system is breaking and they have no other option left. Then that leads us directly into the next truth. The Fed's balance sheet is now permanently elevated, sitting at around $6.7 trillion today. It cannot shrink further without crushing repo markets, draining bank reserves, and triggering another liquidity seizure. Meanwhile, raising interest rates would blow out credit markets and push borrowing costs into levels that destabilize banks and corporations. This is what boxed in means in real time. The Fed has run out of safe moves. Every lever they pull now risks breaking something else. They're out of time, they're out of cash, and they're out of options. This is exactly why QE must return, and inflation will ignite the moment that it does. Now, here's the part that most Americans are not prepared for. See, when QE returns this time, it won't behave like the QE of the past 2010s. Back then, government spending was relatively restrained, and most of the printed money stayed locked inside the financial markets. It inflated stocks and bonds, but consumer prices barely moved. Today, the situation is completely different. Deficits are enormous. Federal spending is still hovering around 23% of GDP. So when the Fed resumes asset purchases, that liquidity will not sit quietly in the bank reserves. It's going to spill into the real economy. That means higher grocery bills, higher rent, higher energy costs, and higher healthcare expenses. The inflation pattern from 2021 through 2022 isn't just returning. It may come back sooner and even harder. And so to understand why this meltdown feels inevitable, you have to step back and look at the Fed's track record since 2008. During the financial crisis, the Fed printed trillions to save the banking system. That created massive asset inflation over a decade. Then COVID hit, and the Fed printed even more money, but this time fueling direct consumer inflation. But the fatal error was never building a real plan to unwind any of it. They assumed that the system could handle a slow reversal. It couldn't. So as we sit here in 2025, the blame doesn't fall on Trump or any other administration. It falls squarely on the Federal Reserve. Their mismanagement set every domino in motion. So this brings us to one of the most sobering realities of this entire situation here. By every meaningful metric, 2025 is now more dangerous than the months leading up to the 2008 crash. Back then, liquidity indicators were deteriorating, but bank reserves were still adequate, and the Fed, they had an empty balance sheet with plenty of room to act. Today, those liquidity indicators are flashing even more violently. SOFR stress, collateral shortages, emergency borrowing, and the banks are carrying heavy unrealized losses on long duration bonds. And at the same time, consumer inflation pressures are still simmering, meaning the Fed can't provide relief without amplifying price spikes. And so we're stuck in this doom loop. Massive deficits force massive issuance, which triggers liquidity stress, which forces QE, which reignites inflation, which pushes deficits even higher. This is a true financial choke point, an inflection moment unlike anything since 2008. And so when QE comes roaring back, which the Fed is all but admitting, the country will split into winners and losers instantly. Now, the winners, they will be holding real assets, stocks, real estate, gold, especially gold and Bitcoin. Now, if you want to learn more about protecting your assets, click the link in the description down below. You'll see a link down below for Noble Gold Investments. Make sure to download your free wealth protection guide. But again, the winners will be people holding real assets, stocks, real estate, Bitcoin, gold, and silver. Anything with scarcity or limited supply tends to surge when the money printer comes alive. But the losers, they're going to feel it everywhere. Savers sitting in cash mainly, they're going to see their purchasing power melt. Fixed income households are going to get squeezed by rising prices without higher income to match. Middle income Americans who rely on stable dollars, not appreciating assets, they're going to fall farther and farther behind. Mark my words, guys, this is why the wealth gap always widens during these QE cycles. The Fed pumps liquidity into markets, asset prices take off, and anyone who's not on board gets left in the dust. It is the same movie every time, and it's about to play again. Now, let's address something crucial because people always ask, Ron, can't President Trump stop this? And the honest answer, based on law, structure, and math, is it's complicated. Trump inherited a fiscal and monetary time bomb that was already ticking long before he took office. The Treasury, not the White House, issues the debt. Congress, not the president, controls the spending. And the Federal Reserve, not the executive branch, controls liquidity operations. You see, Trump can push for lower spending. He can pressure Congress. He can appoint tougher fiscal hawks, but he can't override the mechanics of a decade of QE, trillions in deficit, deficits or a liquidity system that is already buckling under stress. This crisis didn't begin with Trump, but navigating it now falls squarely on his watch, and that's the brutal truth. So here's where everything comes together in one brutal, unavoidable sequence. The liquidity meltdown forces the Fed to intervene. That intervention will be new QE. And so new QE pushes liquidity into a system already running massive deficits. That liquidity fuels another inflation spike. Inflation then pressures the government to spend more on interest and social programs, expanding deficits further. Those deficits force even more treasury issuance, which overloads the repo market again, bringing us right back to the start of the loop. And the cycle isn't theoretical. It's unfolding right now in November 2025, and the harsh reality is this: we're not at the end of a crisis. We are standing at the beginning. The opening chapter of the next financial era has already been written. The only question is whether Americans recognize it in time to protect themselves or get swept away by the wave.